Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. We have been talking in this series about kidney disease and heart disease and how they go together and the things that you should know. And we are delighted today to have Kondziolka join us, and she is going to introduce herself and she's going to talk about nutrition and the renal diet. So Katie, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Like Jody mentioned, my name's Kondziolka. I'm a registered licensed dietitian. I also carry a credential of certified clinical transplant dietitian. I work at mHealth Fairview in Minneapolis at the clinic and surgery center, mostly in solid organ transplant, seeing all organ transplant patients, as well as many chronic kidney disease patients apart from transplant. So today we'll talk about nutrition and the renal diet. An overview of what we'll talk about are the various components of the renal diet, the evidence-based guidelines to back up what we're talking about, interpreting lab values, an individualized approach, and a recap of the discussion today. First, we'll start with components of the renal diet and evidence-based guidelines. They'll kind of intertwine as we go for this first section. So the components of the renal diet are sodium, potassium, and phosphorus, protein, and fluids. The evidence-based guidelines are what are called the KDOQI guidelines, which stands for Kidney Disease Outcomes Quality Initiative. They were first released in 1999. They were last updated in 2020, which is where I'm pulling my information from today. And they update these guidelines every 5 years. They are created by both National Kidney Foundation and the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. These guidelines are available to anyone online via a Google search. There's I think, close to 100-page PDF. This is where I'm getting this information from. So it is accessible to anyone. A quick graphic with the different stages of kidney disease, starting with stage 1, which you would call normal kidney function on the left-hand side, all the way down through stage 5 and kidney failure, ultimately requiring dialysis or a transplant. Most of this discussion will be focused on stages 3A through 5, so a GFR of less than 60. So starting with sodium, the KDOQI guidelines say for stages 3 through 5 of chronic kidney disease, limit sodium to less than 2,300 milligrams per day to reduce blood pressure and improve volume control. Now, this information is from an article that recently came out this year from today's Dietitian. An article is called Updated Guidelines for Low Sodium Diets. So some highlights that I want to share with you from this article are that salt sensitivity is prevalent in about half of people with high blood pressure and a quarter of people with normal blood pressure. So what that means is some people are more sensitive to eating salt than other people. And in those people with salt sensitivity, it's more crucial to watch your diet. This article is stating that the recommended intake for sodium is 1,500 to 2,000 milligrams per day. And for those with chronic kidney disease, even those who do not have high blood pressure, eating too much sodium can overwhelm the kidneys, making them work harder and may lead to further progression of the kidney disease. For those people on dialysis, taking this even further, following a sodium restriction helps lower inflammatory response, which improves overall prognosis. And then we're also talking about some heart disease today. So in terms of heart failure, the Heart Failure Society of America recommends between 2,000 to 3,000 milligrams per day of sodium in all heart failure patients and less than 2,000 milligrams per day for people with moderate to severe heart failure, noting that high blood pressure is a risk factor for heart failure. For perspective, the average American who's not following any diet restrictions gets anywhere from like 4,000 to 6,000 milligrams of sodium per day. You'll see here that there's varying recommendations on this slide and the previous slide with different ranges for adequate sodium intake. I typically recommend a good 2,000 milligrams per day. That just kind of keeps it simple. We'll get into that a little bit further along the way as well. So I get asked this question a lot. Well, gosh, when I get my blood work done, my sodium lab value is fine, or it's even low. Shouldn't I be eating more salt? Or maybe I'm just fine, I don't need to restrict salt in my diet. Well, it's not quite as a direct indicator with diet as one may think or hope. So the sodium lab value does not indicate how well you're doing with diet. That lab value is often diluted or falsely low or inaccurate based on how much water someone drank that day, how much water they're retaining, and that comes along with heart disease and kidney disease. So again, not an accurate indicator for what you're eating. For reminder purposes, 1 teaspoon of table salt is a little bit more than the general recommendation of sodium per day for a low sodium diet. And then I also get asked a lot, well, pink salt, I'm choosing that instead. That's healthier for me. And for someone who's watching the sodium in their diet, all the salts are really, really similar in terms of sodium content. So pink salt versus, iodized salt versus sea salt. There's a lot more out there than those, but they all contain the same amount of sodium, roughly within a few hundred milligrams per the volume or the weight of the product. And as a reminder, only 20% of the sodium we eat or take in is from a salt shaker, which leaves the remainder 80% from the highly processed foods, convenience foods, food outside the home that is so prevalent in our society now. So again, touching on why is this important? We already discussed this a little bit, but following a sodium restricted diet helps with managing blood pressure, controlling fluid retention or edema, preventing excess thirst, and reducing overall stress on the kidneys. Also, back to the excess thirst piece, a fair amount of people with heart disease and kidney disease are on a fluid restriction. And if someone is eating too much salt and water travel together. So the more salt you eat, the more water you want to drink or shifts around internally in your body, creating someone to be thirstier. So by reducing your sodium intake, it's easier to stay within a fluid restriction if you are on one. Kind of stating the obvious here, but never a bad reminder of what foods are high in sodium. The list can go on and on, but some top ones are anything processed. So that's anything boxed, canned, frozen meals, snack, junk foods, ramen noodles, things like that. Deli meat, whether it's from the deli counter or prepackaged, they're both high in sodium unless you find a low sodium variety, and you can find them both at the deli counter or prepackaged. There's a common misconception that from the deli counter is fresher or healthier, and it's not the case. Cold cuts, hot dogs, sausages, things like that also have a lot of sodium. Cheese, cottage cheese, tomato juice like V8, canned vegetables, pickles, olives, sports drinks, things like that. Here's a good comparison slide of chicken broth. So cooking things at home is usually ideal. That way you can control how much sodium you put into your food. And making homemade soup is a great idea, but thinking of broth, which makes up most of the soup, that can make or break a low sodium or high sodium soup. So on the left, we have regular chicken broth. 1 cup only has almost 900 milligrams of sodium, which is almost half the recommended amount for the day. Then the middle picture is a reduced sodium, which still has a lot, in my opinion, almost 600 milligrams a day. And then we have an unsalted version, which people actually say they like taste-wise, surprisingly. Some people like to do a mixture of unsalted and lower sodium to kind of, have a combination here, meet in the middle, but just something to consider. And not pictured here are like bouillon cubes or chicken flavoring or paste, things like that. And those would have similar sodium contents. They're very high sodium unless you find a low sodium alternative, which they do sell. The next 2 slides will show some common restaurant food items, and any restaurant with, I think it's more than 20 locations, will have the nutrition information online, which is always helpful to consider looking at before you go out, because as you see the top item here, McDonald's bacon ranch chicken salad with grilled chicken, not fried chicken, has 1,240 milligrams of sodium. So over half your day, and you think you're making a good choice by eating the salad, when in reality, you would honestly be better off choosing the cheeseburger. So looking online before dining out helps guide what you decide on and makes you feel a little bit more confident in that you can eat something out. Just takes a little planning ahead of time. The last one here, Jimmy John's Turkey Tom, again, super high in salt, almost, almost 3/4 of your day. And people again think, gosh, I'm going to choose Jimmy John's. It's not anything fast food like McDonald's. It's fresher and healthier for me. But in terms of sodium, it may not be. And that sodium comes from all pieces of the sandwich. The bread is really high sodium, cheese, any condiments, deli meat, things like that. 2 more examples. Applebee's, just the salmon. I know the photo here has other sides, but we're just looking at the salmon with a glaze on there, and that's 1,500 milligrams of sodium, which, gosh, if you were to make something similar at home, it would probably be 200 or 300 milligrams, is my guess. Then Chipotle as well, I get the comment of it's healthier, it's nothing deep fried, but sodium, again, really high here. So over your whole day with just a bowl, and if you add a tortilla, so in form of burrito, that adds 600 milligrams of sodium. Chipotle does have a calculator online where it adds and subtracts in front of you based on which ingredients you click. So I found it interesting that clicking the fresh tomatoes or the pico, that has 500 milligrams of sodium just in that salsa alone, whereas the other more processed ground up salsas have only 200 or 300. So again, surprising, you never know until you look. Some tips to reduce sodium intake. I recommend people track their intake for a few days to understand what foods contribute most of your sodium intake. And you can track on pen and paper for a few days on a notepad, or the bottom photo is of a popular app called MyFitnessPal, which is free. And you can scan barcodes of items, type in Jimmy John's Turkey Tom. At the end of the day, it will tally up all the nutrients, including sodium, which is kind of the focal point here. And people have often tracked at some point in their history of following a low sodium diet, but it's always helpful to revisit every now and then because we get used to what we're eating and have mental calculators going on. But when we sit down and we really evaluate our diet more routinely, sometimes things pop up that we don't realize we're snacking on this, or I've gotten lax with this thing. So again, it's helpful to touch base once in a while. And the second point, that lower sodium is not always better. I get a lot of people in clinic trying to eliminate all sodium, and they're tracking diligently, and they're averaging 500 up to 1,000 milligrams per day, and their symptoms aren't any better. They are retaining more water. They have a poor quality of life. They're not enjoying what they're eating. It's too restrictive. So finding a good middle ground, I recommend 1,500 to 2,000 milligrams per day. Remember, it's a low sodium diet, not a no sodium diet. So those things can happen, and I've seen it before. So don't try to eliminate it altogether. We already talked about looking online when going out. You can ask for no added salt when you go out to eat, even at McDonald's. Don't add salt to my burger, and they will make you a fresh one. Or at restaurants, you can ask for items not to be salted extra when they're making it. Granted, some things are pre-marinated or prepped ahead of time before you order, so there's only so much that can be done, but it's still worth asking. And just, of course, kind of the obvious, but what's left, we talked about all the high sodium foods, but on the opposite side, really, minimally processed foods are kind of what you want to stick with. So fresh fruits and vegetables, frozen vegetables, fresh meats, chicken, beef, fish, eggs, grain staples like white rice or pasta that aren't seasoned like rice-a-roni. So kind of keeping it simple, scaling back and figuring out what are the basic things that I can still eat. Up next is potassium. So KDOQI states that for stages 3 through 5, to adjust dietary potassium intake to maintain serum potassium or blood potassium within normal limits. And both hypo or hyperkalemia, which is low or high blood potassium, can have negative side effects or consequences like muscular weakness, high blood pressure, heart issues, and even death. So it can be a pretty severe thing if someone's potassium is out of whack. It's not just a nice thing to do with your diet. It can be pretty severe. This is referencing another article from today's Dietitian a few years back about how increasing potassium can be helpful for heart health. So kind of what we're not used to hearing with kidney disease, but want to shed light on the other side of it as well. The New England Journal of Medicine states there is abundant evidence that indicates a potassium deficit or too little has a critical role in high blood pressure and cardiovascular events. Research shows that consuming just adequate enough potassium, not too much, not too little, can help improve heart health and reduce blood pressure. So there's a positive effect on consuming potassium. The Institute of Medicine set the adequate intake. Again, this is kind of for the general person without medical conditions at 4.7 grams per day of potassium, which equals 9 or 10 servings of fruit and veggies, or total about 4 to 5 cups a day combined of fruits and vegetables. It's important to find a balance of how much potassium someone can consume for heart benefits, but also we're looking with the lens of a CKD diagnosis. So again, we'll get into this more later about individualizing potassium, but just throwing this research out there because it's not talked about as much as it should be. Potassium is a mineral found in our food, and it is newly required on nutrition labels in the past few years, which makes it helpful to track potassium intake if someone needs to do that. I don't recommend everyone does that, but it can be helpful if someone's potassium is persistently high. The photo here is a picture of the label from Fairlife chocolate milk. So 1 cup of this milk has 550 milligrams of potassium. And underneath that red circle I put on there is 16%. So I usually encourage people to use milligrams both for sodium and potassium because percents are based on that adequate intake for the general person, which may be different for someone with medical conditions. So always try to look at the milligrams. And remember the previous slide, the adequate intake for an average person was like 4,700 milligrams of potassium. But if someone actually does have to monitor potassium, again, based on lab values, a reduced potassium diet has about 2,000 to 3,000 milligrams per day. Some common high potassium foods. Want to make note on the cooked greens, the plate of cooked spinach here. Raw spinach in a salad, again, we're thinking portion size. We can't forget about that. If someone has a pretty normal portion size of spinach that's on a salad raw, that would be considered a low potassium food. But once you cook a lot of vegetables, greens included, it condenses so much, it becomes more concentrated. So the potassium increases and these things go from a low potassium food up to a high potassium food. Also to note those salt substitutes there on the left-hand side. Of course, people are interested in them because most of the time they're trying to eat less sodium. So they're picking up these things that mimic salt. They're white. They have somewhat of a similar taste to salt, but they put potassium in them. So if someone has issues with potassium levels, these things are not usually advised. Low potassium foods, again, portion size is huge. I didn't put watermelon on here. That's a really common one I run into trouble with in the clinic, where 1 cup of watermelon is considered a low potassium food, but who eats 1 cup of watermelon? I get a lot of people who eat, half the watermelon, and that explains their high potassium level. All right, moving on to phosphorus. So KDOQI states for stages 3 through 5, to adjust dietary phosphorus to maintain serum phosphate levels within normal, just like the recommendations for potassium. High phosphorus in your blood can lead to bone and mineral problems, which can be more significant with people who are not urinating or people who are on dialysis. So high phosphorus levels can cause bone loss, basically, if it's left high persistently. And people with high phosphorus levels also progress faster to end-stage renal disease than if you had normal phosphorus levels. So going back to if your labs are elevated consistently, that puts stress on your kidneys and makes them decline a little bit further than they would otherwise, or quicker. So if a low phosphorus diet is indicated, again, based on elevated lab values, the suggested range for intake is 800 to 1,000 milligrams per day. This is not really on the nutrition label like we saw for potassium, so that makes it really tough. It's usually down below where they have certain percents, only no milligrams. And again, this percent is not really helpful because it is meant for the general population. So the next slide will show a photo of looking under the ingredient section, which is what I recommend people to do, to look for any words that start with phos. And that means it's been added to the food, and then that will affect your levels. There's different forms of phosphorus. So this slide focuses on naturally occurring phosphorus. There's plant-based phosphorus, like in nuts, beans, lentils, and that's absorbed in our body about 20 to 50%. Then there's animal-based phosphorus, like eggs, fish, chicken, beef, dairy, and that's absorbed up to 60%. Then we think of all the additives, which we'll get to again with that ingredient label, but those are absorbed really close to 100%, and they really impact people's levels. So it's in pretty much any processed packaged junk food, processed deli meats. If you look on the label, will have phosphorus additives, even if it's a low sodium product. Diet Coke, dark sodas, Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, even jarred garlic. I was surprised. I looked at in my own, when I was cooking with it at home, and I was surprised to see they add phosphorus to that as a preservative. So it really is in a lot of our foods. Here's the ingredient list for Totino's pizza rolls, and you'll see there's so many ingredients in here, number one, but number two, there's 4 red circles which highlight the phosphorus additives that are found or added to this product. And these levels, we don't know how much is added, right? It doesn't say that on there. And we know that foods at the top of the list, like flour and the tomato puree, those are the highest amounts in the food. And then as you go down the list, that's smaller and smaller amounts that are present in the food. But still, again, these additives are absorbed really readily in our body. They're very bioavailable, so they impact your levels a lot more than, say, eating an egg. So tying phosphorus into heart health, avoid highly processed foods for both heart health, general health, and sodium and phosphorus additives. So if people are reducing their sodium intake by avoiding a lot of these processed foods, their phosphorus should fall into check and just kind of follow suit with that. KDOQI guidelines for protein. So there's a few different categories here, which we'll break down further. The first one is for stages 3 through 5 without diabetes, a protein restriction, and here are some numbers for you, of 0.55 to 0.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. So these are calculations that us dietitians use to calculate protein and other needs based on kilograms. And then for comparison, for someone with diabetes, the protein amount is a little bit more just to help with blood sugar control. Then for someone who's on dialysis, the protein needs are almost double of the prior categories because people lose a lot of nutrition and protein when they're dialyzing, and you need to replace that. Otherwise, you'll feel really weak, tired, low energy. So this is the first category with someone stages 3 through 5 without diabetes. The protein restriction looks like this. So I have 2 different groups going on here. There's a 150-pound female and a 180-pound male, and then I have their kilograms there, which is what the calculations are based on. And this shows the protein range for those individuals. So what this would look like roughly in terms of food for the day for protein only is 5 ounces of chicken, say on a salad or, with a side of vegetables and starch, and then an egg, say in the morning with a piece of toast and some sauteed peppers and onions, and then a 1/4 cup of nuts as a snack. And then we'll have another meal in there somewhere that's lower on the protein. This is the category for people with diabetes, just a little bit more protein. So take the previous slide and then add a Greek yogurt cup to meet that goal. And then for someone on dialysis, there's a lot more protein. Say starting on the bottom left, a serving of whey protein powder is 20 grams, roughly. They all vary a bit, but thinking of what you mix that in with could provide more protein as well, say milk or yogurt or something of that nature. Say if you had 2 tablespoons of peanut butter on some toast, that would give you more protein, a Greek yogurt, a hamburger patty, some eggs for breakfast, and maybe a 1/4 cup of cooked lentils on a salad. And that would hit your protein goals for the day being on dialysis. It's helpful to keep in mind to not over restrict protein. This is another common comment I get of people coming in, that when they meet with their nephrologist and they have the beginning stages of CKD stage 3, they're told to cut out the protein, kind of a generic blanket statement that people often take to the extreme, and they cut out all protein, only eating starches, rice, vegetables, fruit, things like that. So reducing protein intake beyond what's recommended increases someone's risk for malnutrition, muscle loss, fatigue, things like that. This slide over here, or the photo I should say on the slide, is of plant-based protein sources. There is a lot of research out there that vegetable protein diets, or more of plant-based or even vegan diet, may slow progression of chronic kidney disease versus an animal protein diet. So I don't always bring this up in my visits with people, because some people, or a lot of people, don't have an interest in eating plant-based or vegan. It is really tough, takes a lot of planning, a lot of change from what most people are used to. But certainly something I'll talk about, because there is a lot of evidence and research on this. Some people may think, oh gosh, phosphorus, they get lists from their doctor. Again, we kind of talked about this on these foods here. They all have phosphorus in them, and they're scared to eat them, and they are told to avoid them. But as we learned, that they're only part of our phosphorus intake. Most of the phosphorus comes from processed foods. So learning that these plant-based proteins do have phosphorus, although it's less bioavailable, less absorbed, and will impact our levels less. That's always good reassurance. Some plant-based resources, some websites that have some good recipes for more plant-based diets. Of course, they're not all low sodium, but that's pretty easy to tweak, omitting the salt or using a low sodium broth, or fresh vegetables instead of canned, things like that. A tidbit on protein and heart health. So we kind of covered plant proteins. Those are a good choice for heart health as well. Lots of fiber and other nutrients. If you are looking for more animal-based products, lean cuts of meat are what's recommended. It's okay to have red meat, but again, lean meats, not processed red meats, up to twice a week is what's kind of the recommendation that's out there. And that eggs do fit into a heart healthy diet. There's been a lot of changing research, I'd say, in the past 15 years about eggs. They were initially thought of as kind of a food you want to avoid, or only eat the white, and that research really does not stand much these days. So focusing on the benefits that eggs provide in moderation. Fluids, just a brief touch on this, that fluid intake is very individualized, and the nephrologist or your cardiologist would advise you on if you need to follow a restricted fluid intake. I usually don't see a fluid restriction unless someone has heart failure, or if they are on dialysis. And even then, if someone's on dialysis, they may be urinating and not need a fluid restriction. So it's really individualized. We have to think of what are fluids. Of course, water, coffee, tea, protein drinks, which do provide benefit, but they are fluids. Soup, anything that melts down into a liquid like ice cream, popsicles, yogurt is a fluid. So we have to think about those things too throughout the day. Next, we're going to move on to interpreting some lab values. So often labs like the comprehensive metabolic panel and or the renal panel, so that includes like sodium, GFR, creatinine, potassium, phosphorus, other labs. Usually they're done every 3 months. Unless someone's on dialysis, then they're done every month. You can ask your doctor for these labs to be done more frequently if you would like, if you're really wanting to watch your trends and help decide on what diet changes need to be done. I've seen people get them done every 2 to 4 weeks, and that's not even too much, it's kind of up to you and what you're able to do. So potassium and phosphorus values may change day to day and even throughout the day. I remember seeing someone in the morning and their potassium was above the recommended range, and somehow they were at another appointment and we had the luxury of having 2 done in the same day, and later that day it was fine. So it's hard to put stock in one abnormal lab value. So that's why it's really important to look at trends and patterns, which we'll get into more. So here are some snippets I pulled from recent patients I've seen. They're all CKD stage 5, not on dialysis. That's just the general, I'd say the most people I see in the clinic fall into this category. Now thinking back, I should have pulled someone stage 3, but the labs really aren't anything abnormal. I've never seen a high potassium with a stage 3 that I can recall in the past almost 10 years. So and the person on the left, see, they've had several labs in the past 9 months or so, and they've had a lot of low potassium even. So this person would not have to follow any potassium restricted diet and would even benefit from including more potassium foods. Otherwise, their doctor may prescribe a potassium pill or supplement. So sometimes it's easier to eat those foods than take a supplement to correct low levels. The middle person, they've had normal lab values for the past 9 months, so no indication to follow potassium restrictions. And again, they're in stage 5 kidney disease. And then the person on the right, they had 1 high value back 9 months ago, but then the rest have been normal. So not sure if this person, I can't recall if they had that 1 high and then they changed their diet based on that one. I don't think so, because that was the only high they had. But again, ever since that time, it's been normal. It could just be he had French fries the night before and it was just a little bit too much for his kidneys to handle. But other than that, he's fine with potassium. A little bit different layout, but looking at phosphorus levels now. So the top person is a dialysis patient that I saw, and they have a history of high potassium. You can see back for at least the past year, maybe even further. This person's diet consisted of mini donuts, spaghetti, milk, cereal, waffles. So that was really all he mentioned to me of his normal food intake, which, thinking of those foods, are more processed, packaged convenience foods, which, as we know, have a lot of phosphorus additives in them. Milk is the only one where it's a naturally occurring phosphorus. Down, the second example is a non-dialysis patient, and her lab values have been all within normal. There is one that's highlighted in yellow. Every system kind of has a different cutoff for what they consider high, and our system, it's above 4.5, but dialysis doesn't consider high phosphorus unless it's above 5. So I wouldn't really be too worried about this level at all either. And this person had a similar diet of highly processed foods: canned soup, sandwiches, hot dish, spaghetti, nuts, fruit. So a lot of those foods have phosphorus in them as well, and this person has within normal levels. So interpreting lab values, it takes some trial and error. It's not black and white, which makes it hard. It makes it, confusing, challenging, all of those fun things. So one person, may be able to eat 3 bananas a week and have normal potassium, no issues. but another person with the same kidney function may need to limit to half a banana or less a week, or just doesn't eat them because they know they spike their potassium. Some people can drink, 2 cups of milk a day, whereas other people switch to almond milk to reduce phosphorus, and then they still have high levels. They're doing everything right, but it's not manifesting in a normal lab value, and that happens a lot, and that's frustrating. And I don't have a good way to explain it, but just sometimes things happen. It's not a do A and B will be your result. It's not always a linear result like that. Now, some people may say, well, almond milk, that has nuts, or it's made of nuts, and nuts do have some phosphorus, although it's plant-based. But almond milk is a recommended choice for someone with high phosphorus, because although almond milk does come from nuts, it is really watered down. It doesn't have hardly any nut or much nutritional value to it, so it is really low phosphorus after all. And then if someone's levels are within range for a really long time, some people like to test the waters and add back in 1 or 2 foods in small controlled quantities and see what happens to their labs. And again, there's no guidebook on how to do this. It's kind of ambiguous. And again, that's unclear. But some people I recommend, okay, you've been really missing potatoes and your potassium has been within normal for 6 months. Let's try having half a baked potato twice a week, and then see what happens to your potassium next time it gets drawn. If it comes back high and that's the only change you made, then you know why. And that was too much that you can't handle. But if you're adding a little bit of potato here and a little banana here and a little tomato product here, and your labs come back high, then you don't know what caused it, right? We kind of have been talking about an individualized approach, but I really want to hammer home that with the kidney diet, one size does not fit all. The renal diet online seems really black and white, which is really confusing. People are getting mixed messages, and it's very restrictive. So a lot of people come in to see me who are referred by their nephrologist, just learning they are diagnosed with CKD stage 3, and their GFR is about 60. Their potassium and phosphorus have had no abnormalities, and they've researched the renal diet online, and they are restricting everything, all the food lists, and we kind of scale it back and review their labs and say potassium and phosphorus restrictions are not needed at this point. Your labs are fine. So let's focus mostly on the sodium and the protein. It's not proactive to restrict potassium and phosphorus before you have high levels. People say, well, shouldn't I avoid bananas and potatoes so my levels don't become high? And it doesn't quite work like that way either, which will make it easy, but it's not easy. So some people I see, and in the labs I showed you from stage 5, they don't have high potassium and they may never will. So might as well keep those foods in until there's reason to change. Some other symptoms, and these are again more towards end stage renal disease or a GFR under 15, but people get uremia, where there's toxins that are building up and they're not urinating them out, and they stay in your blood and kind of cause these negative side effects like nausea, vomiting, poor appetite, taste changes, things tasting metallic, losing appeal for foods, fatigue, low energy, and weight loss as a result of this. So sometimes people in this situation have to focus on snacking more during the day, grazing, instead of having 3 meals, which they may be used to. And that's a hard change. It sounds pretty straightforward and easy, but changing that habit or timing of eating is easier said than done. Ginger or mint to help with nausea can really help. There are medications to help for nausea, but some people swear by ginger chews, ginger tea, mint tea, or lifesavers, and how they help with nausea better than medication. Again, it's trial and error. For people with these symptoms, liquids may be better tolerated than eating solid foods. So then we're thinking including more oral nutrition drinks to help get in enough nutrition. Again, we don't want to have someone become malnourished if we can try to mitigate that. Some protein supplements here, and again, if someone is using these on dialysis, there's really no worry about how much they're consuming. But if for someone like earlier stages, if if someone's eating too many protein supplements and they really pack a lot in there, so they add up to your daily goal more quickly than say other foods. Again, something to consider with what stage you're at and how much protein you can take in that's safe for your kidneys. But these are a few examples of kidney-friendly protein bars. And with that, I mean not too high in sodium, lower potassium, and lower phosphorus. So there's bars, there's pre-made drinks, protein powders are kind of the most clean, if you want to think of it that way. There should hopefully not be a lot of additives in there. And people mix them in with, say, almond milk and fruit or water, things like that. So there's a lot of options and variety out there. Just a little tidbit on herbal and alternative medicines. I get a lot of questions about this. The first statistic is that more than half of US adults are using some form of dietary supplement that could be as harmless as a multivitamin or vitamin D, or in this herbal or alternative medicine category. And it accounts for more than $14 billion in sales per year in the supplement category. Natural does not always equal safe. People think it is coming from the ground, it's a natural product, it's not going to cause me any harm, but that does not mean it is safe either. So there are some issues that do come up with supplements. The first one being they're not regulated, so things are often reported after something bad happens with supplements. You know, medications are studied well before they hit the market and are available for people, but supplements, it's kind of backwards. They hit the market first, and then if there's anything adverse, people report that, or hopefully report, and many people don't, adverse effects. Herbal medicine or complementary medicine often interacts with medications, which can reduce or increase your medication potency. There's some unknown effects on the organs. I've had some people come in needing liver transplants by taking some crazy supplements that they buy, you know, at Costco or something. So you just never know. Everyone can have a different response to these products as well. If I take green tea extract and then my dad takes it, we could have a different response. I could go into liver failure. He may be just fine. Even comparing the same brand, different batches could have different strengths in there. It says there's these items in the supplement and it may or may not even be in there. They may add extra things to the supplements. Again, there's so many nuances around that it's not regulated and what that can result in. So green tea extract is a common one. So people can drink green tea all they want. It's very dilute, but extract form, which can be just fat burning pills, green tea pills, or it can make its way into some protein powders or energy drinks, for example. An extract form has been linked to liver failure in many cases. So that's just one common supplement I want to point out. So we'll talk a little bit about a recap on some of the top information that we covered today. And for anyone with chronic kidney disease or any kidney dysfunction, I really talk mostly about a low sodium diet for blood pressure control and just to reduce the stress on the kidneys, and getting the right amount of protein based on your weight so you don't stress the kidneys out too much. Think of general healthy diet that should be recommended for the general population, although most of the general population eats processed food anyway. But think of what's recommended for most people is what's recommended for someone with chronic kidney disease. Minimally processed foods, fresh foods, things like that. And then for some people, again, based on lab work, potassium and or phosphorus diet restriction may be warranted. Some resources that are helpful, some websites on the left, National Kidney Foundation, DaVita, Fresenius, those are 2 dialysis units, and I put those on there not for people who are on dialysis, but they have a lot of education and resources on just general kidney diet for people who are well before dialysis. DaVita does provide what's called a Kidney Smart class, so some of you have maybe been referred to that by your nephrologist. Even in the early stages of kidney disease. And this I've heard is they give you a lot of information kind of on the most restrictive piece, again, to not leave anything out, but that doesn't mean it's always relevant to everyone. And then I'm piloting a new class with one of our nephrologists at MHealth Fairview with a group class on CKD, mostly focusing on nutrition. Additionally, there's various cookbooks out there. There's a lot of online resources, like too many to list, but if people usually Google low sodium recipes and then modify if you need to follow a low potassium diet, avoiding tomato dishes or potatoes, that's kind of the easier way to do it than looking for renal specific recipes, because they're often more restrictive and harder to find. Just a few words tying back in the heart health of this all, and that the pieces of these diets are good for the kidneys and the heart. Number one being DASH diet, which stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension, which focuses on foods rich in potassium, calcium, and magnesium. So if potassium is not an issue for you, finding the benefits of fruits and vegetables for heart health. This diet is low in sodium, and it focuses on fresh whole foods that are not processed. And another somewhat similar diet, but another heart healthy diet is Mediterranean diet, focusing more on plant-based foods, healthy fats, think chia seed, avocado, olives, nuts, fish twice a week, dairy and poultry in moderation, and lots of fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. And keep in mind, this is kind of the biggest point. The two main causes of CKD are uncontrolled high blood pressure and uncontrolled or poorly controlled diabetes. So if you have one of those conditions, keeping control over those really helps delay progression of kidney disease, whether that's controlling your blood pressure by medication and or diet. As long as it's well controlled, that helps protect your kidneys. And same with diabetes, whether it's medication or diet, there's so many ways to manage diabetes. As long as it's fairly well controlled, say for people with an A1C of less than 7, that puts someone at lower risk for having further kidney decline. So I'll leave it up for questions.